We will now move on to one of the most famous parts of contemporary epistemology, which is the so-called analysis of knowledge. And the analysis of knowledge is really the project of trying to define what knowledge is, to give criteria for knowledge. Now, before delving into the most famous analyses of knowledge, which I will do in the next videos, I want to talk in this video about the underlying method here. What are philosophers doing when they are doing such an analysis, or a conceptual analysis, as we like to call it? What are they doing? How do they do it? Why would you do it? And what are the difficulties you might run into when you're trying to do that? So I want to discuss with you the very idea of performing a conceptual analysis. So when we do a conceptual analysis, we start with some concept that we kind of grasp, that we think is philosophically important, but that we want to understand better. And so we ask the question, well, what is knowledge? What is science? What is justice? What is, and so on and so forth. And this kind of question, like where we take a philosophically pregnant term and we ask what is, and then we try to give some kind of definition, that kind of project is intimately familiar to us already from the dialogues of Plato. So many of the dialogues of Plato, including many of the early dialogues of Plato, in which he probably is closest to what the historical Socrates was doing, many of the dialogues of Plato are precisely about such a question, right? Socrates goes out into Athens and he wants to know what is justice, or he wants to know what is piety, or maybe he wants to know what is the sophist, or something like that. And so what we find, especially in the early dialogues, is that things often proceed in the following way, right? Socrates comes to some person who is supposed to know a lot about courage, say, and he asks that person, hey, what is courage? And then the person says something like, fighting the enemy without turning your back and fleeing, even when they are stronger than you are, that is courage. And then Socrates might say something like, well, that's certainly an example of courage, right? We agree that that's an example of courage, right? Even in the face of overwhelming odds, to stand your ground. Okay, that's an example of courage. But what is courage? I mean, giving an example isn't like giving a sort of general theory or general account of courage, right? It doesn't really explain why this is an example of courage. It doesn't really tell us what all the examples of courage share, right? The thing that all examples of courage share is presumably courage, courageousness. And now we want to know what that is. And merely giving a list of examples, Socrates is telling us, that is not an analysis. That is at least not the kind of answer that as philosophers we can be happy with, right? As philosophers we want more. We do not just want a list of examples. We also don't just want a list of examples and a list of counterexamples. I mean, that would be like, it might strengthen the story. I give you some examples of courage, and then I give you some counterexamples, some things that are not courage, right? But none of that, although it may be helpful, none of that is going to be a sort of general account or definition or, a kind of philosophical answer to the question, what is courage? So the ideal that Socrates is positing for us in those dialogues by Plato, or the ideal that Plato is positing for us in those dialogues about Socrates, is having a definition or account that will allow you to determine for any supposed example whether it's really courage or not, whether it's really knowledge or not. And so what we really want is what philosophers nowadays would call, we want a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. Or to say it even more precisely, we want to have a set of conditions that are individually necessary, right? Each of them is necessary. Each of them has to be sort of, you have to be able to mark them off to say, yes, okay, it has this, and it has that, and it has that. So they are each individually necessary, and jointly, together, they are sufficient. Each of them is something you have to be courage or knowledge or whatever it is that we're analyzing. And if you have all of them, then that is enough, right? And that is sufficient. If you have all of them, then it really is courage or knowledge or whatever it is. So what we are looking for when we are doing a conceptual analysis in philosophy is we are looking for a set of conditions, each of which is necessary, right? None of them is superfluous, none of them can be missed. So they're individually necessary and they are jointly sufficient. If you actually do meet all of the conditions, then you are the thing. And so the way that we would normally state that, say that, formulate that in philosophy is using this little logical phrase called if and only if, right? So we would say something like, well, X is an example of courage if and only if, well, and then you have a list of conditions, right? And so X is an example of courage if those conditions are met. So you've got to meet the conditions. If you meet the conditions, then it's courage. But also only if you meet the conditions, right? These are precisely the conditions that you have to meet. Okay, so a philosophical conceptual analysis is supposed to end with a claim of the form X is courage if and only if blah-di-da-di-da. Or S knows that P, right? This person, subject S, knows this proposition P if and only if, and then we've got a list of things, right? That's supposed to be the general form of one of these conceptual analyses. Now, when somebody gives such a conceptual analysis, how do we know whether it's right? How do we know whether it's right? Okay, well, here philosophers, again, following Socrates, are generally very interested in examples and in counterexamples. So if I give you, for instance, an analysis of courage, then what you're going to do is you're going to apply it to a lot of examples of courage and also to a lot of examples of not courage, right? Of cowardice, for instance. And you're going to check whether my analysis says the right thing, right? So if I've tried to do this, if I've said, well, something is a courageous action if and only if it is done in the face of an overwhelming enemy, then you might say, well, okay, here's one example. The example is fighting on in the face of an overwhelming enemy. And you check my analysis, right? Yeah, this is done in the face of an overwhelming enemy. So my analysis says that it's courageous, and you already thought that it was courageous, so that's fine, that's great. Okay, now you take another example, right? Maybe an example of something that is courageous. Maybe it's very courageous to jump into the river to try to save a drowning child, right? And so you check it out. So is this done in the face of an overwhelming enemy? And there's no enemy. Right? It would be extremely metaphorical to call the river an enemy. There's no enemy here. So that's a problem for my analysis, because you have found something that is courageous, but according to my analysis, it isn't. Okay, that's a problem. Or you might find a counterexample of a different type. You might find something that fits my analysis but isn't courageous. Right? What about running away from an overwhelming enemy? Right? I mean, my analysis said something is courageous if and only if it is done in the face of an overwhelming enemy. Well, running away in the face of an overwhelming enemy is done in the face of an overwhelming enemy, so my analysis claims that it's courageous. And it isn't. Right? So my analysis can go wrong in two different ways. It can go wrong because it turns out that my conditions are not jointly sufficient. Right? Even if you have all of them, it still might not be courage, such as running away in the face of an overwhelming enemy. That fits my analysis, but it shows that my analysis is too permissive. right? Because it counts running away as courageous even though it isn't. So my conditions were not sufficient. The other counterexamples showed that my conditions were not necessary, right? Because jumping into this raging river to save that child, it's very courageous, but it didn't fit my analysis, right? So my analysis was too strict. It was too permissive, but it's also too strict. It's too strict because it claims that, this thing doesn't fit. It's not courage, but it is courage. So my analysis in this particular case fails on both accounts. These conditions are not necessary. So my analysis is too strict. And these conditions are not sufficient, right? And so my analysis, wait a second, did I say that the right way around? These conditions are not necessary, and so my analysis is too strict, and these conditions are not sufficient, and so my analysis is too permissive. Is that right? If the conditions are not sufficient, that means that, something can fit all the conditions and it's still not courage, right? So I'm permitting too much. It's too permissive. Yeah, that's the right way to say it. Now, that's how philosophers generally use this kind of method. What they do is they come up with a purported analysis and then they just start looking at a lot of examples. And they try to come up with examples that make trouble for analyses, right? So somebody gives an analysis and then I try to come up with examples that make trouble for this analysis, right? I try to show that there are cases that don't fit. And so this is often called the method of counterexamples, right? Somebody gives an analysis, you try to find a counterexample. If there are counterexamples, the analysis can't be right. We've got to come up with a better analysis. We're going to see this in practice when we look at analyses of knowledge. Now, there's something a little bit paradoxical, or maybe even very paradoxical, about this whole method of conceptual analysis and using counterexamples. And it's something that, again, Plato had already seen. So in the Meno, which is precisely about analyzing knowledge, Meno, the character Meno, points out that there's something weird, right? I mean, if I suppose that I already know what knowledge is, right, then it would be really weird to search for an analysis of knowledge because I already know what knowledge is, right? But suppose that I don't know what knowledge is. Well, then it makes sense that I try to find an analysis, but it doesn't make a lot of sense that I've got all these examples. I mean, how could I know that this is an example of knowledge and that is not an example of knowledge unless I already know what knowledge is? And so in general, what we seem to find in these cases of conceptual analysis is that on the one hand, as philosophers, we already know what courage is or justice or knowledge because, hey, we have all these examples and counterexamples. And so apparently we already know that, well, these are examples of knowledge and these are examples of not knowledge. How do we know unless we already know what knowledge is? But if we already know what knowledge is, why don't we just write it down instead of looking for a definition? And so we find ourselves as philosophers generally in this kind of weird situation where on the one hand we like to say, yeah, we know what knowledge is. Yeah, but we don't have an account of knowledge. I mean, we're searching for a definition or account of knowledge, for an analysis of knowledge. So how does that work? Well, the way that we phrase it usually is that we say something like, well, we have certain intuitions about knowledge, right? Certain pre-theoretical intuitions. There are these clear cases of knowledge and clear cases of not knowledge, or clear cases of courage and clear cases of not courage. And we usually, in contemporary analytic philosophy, talk about that in terms of intuition. And you shouldn't put too much theoretical stress on that term, probably. I mean, that's just a sort of technical term for the ideas that we start out with that seem extremely convincing to us and that sort of regulate how we use those terms, right? If somebody came along with an analysis of knowledge that didn't fit our intuitions at all, we would think that it's not an analysis of knowledge. Okay, so apparently we start out with a certain feel for how this concept is to be used, right? And now we want a strict analysis in terms of sufficient and necessary conditions that fits that feel. Okay. It is a little bit mysterious how this works. Plato himself, again, Plato, has a very elaborate answer. Plato himself is going to argue that, well, actually, we do indeed already know what courage is and what knowledge is and so on and so forth. And that's because before our birth, we were familiar with the pure forms, the form of courage and the form of knowledge and so on and so forth. But then when we were incarnated in a material body, we forgot about it. And now we've got to remember it. And so what philosophy is remembrance. It's trying to remember, get back the knowledge that we already had, but that we lost. And this is called anamnesis. So Plato's theory is a theory of anamnesis, where in philosophy we recollect the knowledge that we already had but lost when we were born in the material world. That's a fascinating theory, but it's not a theory that's extremely popular nowadays. A contemporary philosopher is a lot more likely to say that, well, apparently we are using terms like courage and knowledge with, at least a certain amount of coherence. And what we're trying to do as philosophers is we're trying to think through what exactly it is that we're doing when we're using this term, right? We're trying to find the relations between the different concepts that we kind of intuitively use in apparently mostly coherent ways. And we're trying to lay bare that coherence, lay bare those conceptual connections. And maybe, we are going to find out that it wasn't perfectly coherent. Right, that our grasp of these notions was a little bit slippery, that we were not always using them consistently. So it's possible, not for Plato, but for us, or most of us, that we find out that how we've been using knowledge, well, it wasn't really perfect, but we can come up with a nice philosophical concept that fits common usage kind of well. And for most philosophers, that would be enough. Kind of well. If it fits kind of well with our intuitions, that would generally seem to be enough. But when is enough enough? Right? What intuitions are you willing to give up? Are there any intuitions that you're willing to give up? Are only weak intuitions to be given up? Or intuitions that people disagree about? Or how does that work? Well, that's a little bit vague. And that's one of the things that philosophers can go on arguing about for quite a while. One final technical term here. If you end up giving a conceptual analysis that sort of improves on how a term is used in everyday use, like making it more clear perhaps, making it more precise, this is often called a rational reconstruction of the term. So when somebody says that they want to give an analysis of knowledge, they're basically saying that they want to give these necessary and sufficient conditions. When somebody says that they want to give a rational reconstruction of knowledge, they're also claiming that, our normal way of talking about it is imperfect, and they want to give us something that is more precise, maybe more useful in philosophy, something like that. And not all philosophers who are engaged in conceptual analysis also think of themselves as engaged in rational reconstruction. But the other way around, you sort of have to. If you're doing rational reconstruction, you're doing conceptual analysis of a particular kind. So that's what I wanted to say as a general story about conceptual analysis in philosophy. And it's a sort of philosophical tool or method that is used widely, especially in what we call analytic philosophy, which more or less gets its name from it, right? Analytic philosophers do conceptual analysis. Yeah, among many other things, I suppose. In the next videos, we're going to apply this method to the concept of knowledge.